If you don't have friends, not because you're antisocial or unlikable, but because friendships just don't seem to work anymore, Carl Jung would say there's a reason. And it's not what you think. Jung discovered that certain personality traits make conventional friendship nearly impossible. Not because these traits are flaws, but because they're markers of psychological development that most people haven't reached. You're not bad at friendship. You've developed beyond the consciousness level where conventional friendship operates. The traits I'm about to describe aren't problems to fix. They're indicators that your psyche has evolved to a point where surface connection no longer satisfies, and deep connection is rare. If you recognize these traits in yourself, Jung would say, you're not broken, you're differentiated. And differentiation, by definition, means you're different from the collective, which includes being unable to form friendships the way most people do. I'm about to walk you through 5 personality traits Jung identified in people who don't have friends, not to make you feel worse about your isolation, but to help you understand your friendlessness isn't your failure, it's your psychology, and understanding why might help you stop trying to force connections that were never going to work. Here's what Jung understood that explains everything. Friendship, as most people experience it, is based on shared unconsciousness. Two people bond through collective values, mutual projections, common enemies, and unspoken agreements to not threaten each other's defenses. It's connection, but it's not consciousness. Before you develop psychologically, this kind of friendship works perfectly. You have things in common, you enjoy each other's company, you support each other within acceptable boundaries. But once you begin individuating, once you start becoming psychologically conscious and authentic, you develop traits that make this kind of friendship impossible. You're not choosing to be friendless. Your psychological development has made you incompatible with how friendship typically functions. And because true friendship requires both people to be at similar consciousness levels, and because most people remain at collective consciousness levels, you end up alone. Jung experienced this profoundly. After his individuation, he found that most of his previous friendships dissolved, not from conflict, but from growing incompatibility. He'd developed traits that made conventional friendship impossible. And while he had deep connections with a few rare individuals, he spent much of his life without what most people would call friendships. He wasn't lonely because he was unlikable. He was alone because his psychological development had taken him to places most people never go. And the traits that emerged from that development, the very traits that made him psychologically mature, also made him unable to participate in conventional social bonding. If you don't have friends, you likely share some of these traits, and recognizing them might help you understand. You're not failing at friendship. Your psychology has evolved beyond what friendship typically requires. Jung's first trait of people without friends. You've lost the ability to participate in social performance. You can't do small talk, can't pretend interest in surface topics, can't perform the social rituals that friendship requires. Not because you're rude, but because your psyche literally rejects inauthenticity now. Before individuation, you could participate in social performance unconsciously. You'd discuss the weather, share gossip, perform interest in topics that didn't actually interest you. These performances felt normal because you didn't recognize them as performances. But once you individuate and find your authentic self, performing becomes impossible. Your psyche experiences social performance as psychological violence. This is why you can't maintain friendships anymore. Friendship requires constant low-level performance, pretending enthusiasm for plans you're not excited about, laughing at jokes that aren't funny, discussing topics that bore you. maintaining interest in people's lives that don't actually interest you. Before awakening, you did this automatically. After awakening, every instance feels like betraying yourself. One of Jung's patients described this trait. I lost all my friendships after my individuation. Not because I stopped caring about people, but because I couldn't perform the social scripts anymore. Friends would call to complain about minor problems, and I couldn't muster the expected sympathy. They'd invite me to parties I knew would be shallow, and I couldn't pretend enthusiasm. They'd want to discuss trivial matters, and I couldn't fake interest. I wasn't trying to be difficult, I just couldn't perform inauthenticity anymore. And friendship, I realized, is 90% performance. Without the ability to perform, I had no friends. She wasn't being judgmental or superior. Her psyche had genuinely lost the capacity to be inauthentic, even in small ways. And since conventional friendship requires constant small performances, she became incapable of friendship as most people experience it. Jung found this in himself as well. After his transformation, he couldn't engage in the social performances his previous friendships required. He couldn't pretend interest in conventional topics. He couldn't perform enthusiasm for social gatherings he found meaningless. His authenticity, which was psychological health, made him socially impossible. This trait doesn't mean you're antisocial. It means your psyche has developed to a point where authenticity is non-negotiable. You can't fake interest, fake enjoyment, or fake connection just to maintain friendship. Your psyche would rather be alone than be false. And since most friendship requires some degree of performance, you end up without friends. But here's what Jung emphasized. This isn't a deficit, it's integrity. Your psyche has developed to a point where it protects your authenticity even at the cost of connection. Most people sacrifice authenticity for belonging. You can't anymore. Not because you're choosing to be difficult, but because your psychological development won't allow you to betray yourself, even for the comfort of friendship. The question isn't, how do I become fake enough to have friends again? It's, how do I accept that authenticity means aloneness until I find the rare people who can meet me there? Jung's second trait. You've developed a need for psychological depth that makes surface connection unbearable. You can't engage in shallow conversation, can't bond over trivial commonalities, can't maintain friendships based on shared activities rather than shared meaning. You need depth, and most people operate exclusively at surface. Before awakening, surface connection satisfied you. Having friends you played sports with, watched movies with, went to bars with, that felt like real friendship. But once your consciousness develops depth perception, surface interaction feels like suffocation. You need conversations about meaning, purpose, psychology, existence. You need connection that engages your whole self, not just your social persona. But most people don't operate at depth, not because they're shallow, but because depth is threatening. It requires vulnerability, self-examination, and willingness to question everything. Most people avoid depth as psychological survival. It would destabilize the identities they have carefully constructed, so they maintain friendships at surface level, which works perfectly for them, but is unbearable for you. One man described this trait. I'd meet people who seemed promising, intelligent, interesting, kind. We'd start becoming friends. Then I'd realize they only wanted surface connection. They'd share activities but not vulnerabilities. They'd discuss current events but not existential questions. They'd offer support but not depth. Every friendship would hit this ceiling where I needed to go deeper and they needed to stay surface. Eventually, I'd feel more lonely in the friendship than alone, so I'd let it fade. Not because they were bad people, but because I needed depth they couldn't or wouldn't provide. He wasn't being demanding or difficult. His consciousness had simply developed to a point where surface connection no longer registered as connection at all. It was like being hungry for protein and being offered sugar. It might be pleasant, but it doesn't satisfy the actual need. Jung experienced this constantly. People would want to be his friend, but they wanted surface Jung, the famous psychiatrist, the interesting intellectual. Very few could meet him at the depths he inhabited. Most friendships would start promisingly, then hit the depth ceiling where the other person couldn't or wouldn't go further. Jung would be left with the choice: stay at surface and feel suffocated, or retreat into solitude. He usually chose solitude, not from misanthropy, but from the understanding that false connection is lonelier than authentic aloneness. This trait means you can't maintain friendships based on shared activities, common interests, or pleasant interaction. You need psychological intimacy, existential exploration, and depth dialogue. And since most people find that kind of intimacy threatening or unnecessary, you're left without friends who can meet you there. But here's Jung's insight. Needing depth isn't your problem, it's your development. Most people never develop past surface interaction because they've built their entire identity at surface level. Going deeper would threaten everything they think they are. You've gone deeper, which means surface connection no longer works. That's not a deficit, it's evolution. It just means your friendship pool is drastically smaller because depth-capable people are rare. Jung's third trait. You've developed psychological self-sufficiency, which means you don't need friendship for the reasons most people do. You don't need friends to validate your worth, distract you from yourself, or provide belonging. You've learned to meet those needs internally, and without those needs driving you, friendship loses its traditional purpose. Before individuation, friendship serves crucial psychological functions. Friends validate your identity. They distract you from loneliness. They provide belonging and social proof. They make you feel less alone in the world. These are legitimate needs, and friendship is how most people meet them. But individuation develops internal capacity to meet these needs yourself. You learn to validate your own worth through relationship with yourself. You learn to sit with loneliness without needing distraction. You learn to belong to yourself rather than needing external belonging. You become psychologically self-sufficient. This is psychological health, but it eliminates the primary drivers of friendship. If you don't need friends for validation, distraction, or belonging, why have friends? The traditional purposes of friendship no longer apply. You're left with friendships that would have to be based on genuine enjoyment and depth connection alone, which is rare. One woman described this trait. After years of therapy and inner work, I realized I didn't need friends anymore. Not in the desperate way I used to need them. I used to need friends to make me feel okay about myself, to distract me from my pain, to prove I was lovable. But I developed the capacity to do all that internally. I could validate myself. I could sit with my pain. I knew I was lovable from self-love. Suddenly, I didn't have the need driving me to maintain friendships. And without that need, most friendships felt optional. I let them fade not because I didn't care, but because I didn't need them. And friendships based on need are the only kind most people know how to have. She wasn't being cold or dismissive. She genuinely developed what Jung called psychological wholeness, the capacity to be complete within herself. But that completeness eliminated the neediness that drives most friendship. Without need, without desperation, without the drive to connect for psychological survival, friendship becomes optional, and optional friendships rarely sustain. Jung himself developed profound self-sufficiency. He could spend long periods in solitude without the loneliness most people experience because he'd developed an internal relationship with his unconscious that met needs others meet through external relationship. This wasn't isolation, it was wholeness, but it meant he didn't need friendship the way most people do. This trait explains why you might not even miss having friends most of the time. You're not lonely in the desperate way you used to be. You've developed internal resources that eliminate the neediness that would drive you to maintain friendships. You're psychologically whole, which is the goal of development, but it means conventional friendship loses its traditional function. Here's what Jung understood. Psychological self-sufficiency is the goal of individuation, but it means you can't participate in friendships based on mutual need, which is how most friendships operate. Two people using each other to avoid themselves, to distract from pain, to validate their worth. That's conventional friendship. Once you don't need those things anymore, you're incompatible with how friendship usually works. If you're recognizing these traits, you can't tolerate inauthenticity, you need depth most people can't provide. You're psychologically self-sufficient. You're understanding why you don't have friends. It's not because you're broken or unlikable. It's because your psychological development has made you incompatible with conventional friendship. Before we explore the final two traits that complete the picture, check out our new guide, True Self-Discovery, with 24 practical reflection exercises designed to help you find your way within. Click below to get True Self-Discovery. Let's continue, because these last two traits reveal why you chose truth over belonging, and why that was the right choice. Jung's fourth trait: you've developed the ability to see through people's unconscious patterns, projections, and defenses in real time. And once you can see this, you can't unsee it. You're watching people operate from unconsciousness while they believe they're conscious, and that awareness makes friendship nearly impossible. After individuation, you develop what Jung called psychological sight, the ability to perceive the unconscious material operating beneath people's conscious behavior. You see their shadow projections, their complexes driving their choices, their defenses protecting their wounds. You understand what's really happening psychologically while they remain unaware. This makes friendship excruciating because you're always aware of dynamics the other person is unconscious of. They think you're having a simple conversation. You're watching their father complex, their projection onto you, their shadow material leaking. They think you're just hanging out. You're perceiving all the unconscious patterns playing out. The gap between what they think is happening and what's actually happening becomes unbearable. One therapist described this trait. After my Jungian training, I couldn't maintain regular friendships anymore. Every interaction, I'd see the unconscious material. My friend would complain about their partner, and I'd see them describing their own disowned qualities. They'd ask for advice, and I'd see they wanted validation for decisions already made. They'd share their problems, and I'd see the secondary gains they were getting from staying stuck. I couldn't just be a friend anymore. I was always seeing the psychology. And that seeing created distance. I couldn't connect at the surface level they needed because I was always aware of the depths they were unconscious of. She wasn't trying to analyze her friends. She'd simply developed perceptual capacity that made surface interaction impossible. Once you can see unconscious material, you can't pretend you don't see it. And maintaining friendship while seeing what the other person is blind to creates profound loneliness, even within the friendship. Jung experienced this acutely. His psychological sight meant he was always aware of dynamics others weren't. People would interact with him through their projections, seeing him as father figure, guru, savior, threat. while completely unaware they were projecting. He'd see the projection while they thought they were seeing him. That gap made genuine friendship nearly impossible. This trait means you can't have unconscious friendships. You can't bond through shared shadow projections because you can see the projections. You can't avoid depth because you perceive the depths whether anyone acknowledges them or not. You can't pretend everything is surface when you're constantly aware of unconscious undercurrents. But here's what makes this trait especially isolating. You can't explain what you're seeing without seeming judgmental or invasive. If you point out someone's projection, they experience it as attack. If you name unconscious patterns, they think you're overanalyzing. If you acknowledge depths they're avoiding, they feel exposed and unsafe. So you stay silent, aware of realities they're blind to, unable to connect authentically, because authentic connection would require acknowledging what they're unconscious of. Jung's solution wasn't to stop seeing. He couldn't. It was to accept that this level of sight means friendship with unconscious people is impossible. He could only have real friendship with people at similar consciousness levels who were also aware of the psychological dynamics he was perceiving. And those people were vanishingly rare. Jung's final trait. At some point, you made a choice, conscious or unconscious, to prioritize authenticity over belonging. You decided being true to yourself mattered more than maintaining friendships. And once you make that choice, conventional friendship becomes impossible because it requires betraying your authenticity to maintain belonging. Most people never make this choice. They sacrifice authenticity for belonging their entire lives. They perform, they conform, they suppress, whatever it takes to maintain connection and avoid isolation. This isn't wrong. It's the choice most humans make because belonging is a fundamental need. But individuation forces a different choice. At some point, continuing to betray yourself for belonging becomes more painful than being alone. You reach a threshold where inauthenticity hurts worse than isolation. So you choose truth over comfort, authenticity over approval, solitude over false connection. And that choice, once made, can't be unmade. You can't go back to performing for belonging once you've tasted the relief of being authentic, even if being authentic means being alone. One man described making this choice. I had a friend group I'd been part of for 10 years. But as I individuated, I realized to maintain belonging in that group, I had to hide who I was becoming. I had to perform the person they expected. I had to suppress my actual thoughts, my real interests, my authentic self. One day I realized I'm lonelier in this group, pretending to be someone I'm not, than I would be alone being myself. So I chose myself. I left the group. I chose authenticity over belonging. And yes, I lost the friendships, but I gained myself. And that trade, painful as it was the right one. He wasn't being selfish or antisocial. He'd reached the developmental point where self-betrayal for belonging was no longer sustainable. His psyche demanded authenticity even at the cost of connection. And once you make that demand of yourself, conventional friendship, which requires constant small self-betrayals, becomes impossible. Jung made this choice after his break with Freud. He could have maintained belonging in the psychoanalytic community by suppressing his divergent ideas. He chose authenticity instead, knowing it would cost him professionally and socially. He spent years in isolation as a result, but that isolation allowed him to develop his authentic work. The choice to prioritize truth over belonging was what made his contribution possible. This trait means you've become someone who can't sacrifice authenticity for friendship. You can't pretend to be less than you are to make others comfortable. You can't hide your truth to maintain belonging. You can't perform a false self to keep friends. Your psyche won't allow it anymore. And since most friendship requires some degree of self-suppression, some conformity to group norms, some performance of acceptable identity, you've become unable to do friendship the way most people do it. You chose yourself over belonging, and that choice means you're alone unless you find the rare people who also chose authenticity and can meet you as you actually are. But here's what Jung emphasized. This choice is the mark of psychological maturity. Children need belonging at any cost. Adults choose belonging that doesn't require self-betrayal. And individuated people choose authenticity even when it means no belonging at all. You're not failing by being friendless. You're succeeding at choosing yourself. Most people never develop the courage to make that choice. Let me bring these traits together. You can't tolerate inauthenticity anymore. Your psyche rejects social performance that friendship requires. You need depth most people can't provide. Surface connection feels like suffocation. You're psychologically self-sufficient. You don't need friendship for validation, distraction, or belonging anymore. You can see through people's unconsciousness, and that sight makes surface friendship impossible. And you chose authenticity over belonging. You decided being true to yourself mattered more than having friends. Jung would say, if you have these traits, you don't have friends because your psychological development has made conventional friendship impossible. Not because you're broken, antisocial, or unlikable, but because you've individuated beyond the consciousness level where typical friendship operates. This isn't failure, it's evolution. You've developed past the point where you can bond through shared unconsciousness, maintain connection through performance, or sacrifice authenticity for belonging. That development is psychological health, but it means you're incompatible with how most people do friendship. The loneliness is real, the isolation is painful, but it's not evidence of deficiency. It's evidence of differentiation. You've become psychologically different from the collective. And differentiation, by definition, means aloneness until you find the rare others who've also differentiated. If you don't have friends and you recognize these traits in yourself, Jung would tell you, stop trying to force yourself back into friendships that require you to betray who you've become. Stop believing something's wrong with you because you can't maintain surface connections. Stop feeling deficient because you can't perform the social rituals that friendship requires. You don't have friends because you've developed beyond conventional friendship. Your authenticity, your depth, your self-sufficiency, your psychological sight, your commitment to truth, these aren't flaws. They're markers of individuation. And individuation means differentiation from the collective, which includes being unable to form friendships the way collective-level people do. This doesn't mean you'll always be alone. It means you'll be alone until you find the rare people operating at similar consciousness levels. Those friendships, when they happen, will be deeper, realer, and more satisfying than any conventional friendship could be. But they're rare because people at your consciousness level are rare. Until then, your task isn't to force friendships that don't work. It's to make peace with your aloneness, to recognize it as evidence of your development, not your deficiency. To understand that being without friends because you can't betray yourself is infinitely better than having friends at the cost of your authenticity. You're not failing at friendship. You've succeeded at becoming someone who can't participate in unconscious connection. That success feels like failure because the world values belonging over authenticity. But Jung would say, you chose the harder, truer path, and that choice is what makes you rare. If you don't have friends and you're tired of being told something's wrong with you, subscribe to the channel. To dive even deeper into Jung's revolutionary psychology and what it means for your spiritual awakening, click the recommended video on your screen now.